April 1945, Western Germany. The war was ending, but death hadn't received the message. The canvas flaps of a German field hospital snapped in the cold wind. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of disinfectant, blood, and damp earth. Dozens of stretchers lined the floor. German soldiers, barely conscious, their gray uniforms stained dark with mud and smoke. A nurse in a faded Red Cross armband pressed her hands against a wound that refused to close. Her face was pale, her eyes sleepless. Outside, the low rumble of engines grew louder. American half-tracks and jeeps approaching. Every German nurse froze. For months, propaganda had whispered that the Americans would show no mercy. They had prepared themselves for arrest, humiliation, perhaps worse. But when the tent flap opened, silence fell. The first U.S. soldier to step inside wasn't holding a rifle. He carried bandages. Another followed, carrying morphine. A medic nodded respectfully to the German nurse and said quietly, "Let's save who we can." The German nurse stared at him in disbelief, then realized, for the first time, that the war outside these walls no longer mattered. By early 1945, the German Reich was collapsing. The once mighty Wehrmacht, feared across Europe, had been pushed back to its own borders. The thunder of Allied artillery echoed across the Rhine River, while American bombers turned cities like Cologne and Dresden into seas of fire. For German civilians and soldiers alike, life had become a daily negotiation between fear, hunger, and survival. Amid this chaos stood a group often forgotten in war stories, the German nurses. They worked under the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, the German Red Cross, and the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen Corps, the female auxiliary corps of the army. Some were trained professionals from pre-war hospitals. Others were young girls drafted into service with only weeks of instruction. By 1945, many were little older than 20, yet they were responsible for keeping hundreds of wounded men alive in conditions that grew worse by the hour. Inside the field hospitals, supplies were vanishing. Morphine, bandages, penicillin, all gone or rationed to the dying. Doctors operated by candlelight as bombs fell outside. Nurses learned to improvise tourniquets from belts, dress wounds with torn sheets, and heat water on makeshift stoves made from ammunition crates. The Red Cross symbol painted on their tents no longer guaranteed safety. Allied pilots, seeking strategic targets, sometimes struck anything that moved. Yet, in spite of everything, discipline persisted. Nurses continued to write reports, maintain order, and comfort the wounded, even when the front line moved so close that the ground itself trembled beneath their feet. In March 1945, the situation worsened dramatically. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting Western Germany. Cities like Remagen, Koblenz, and Bonn became battlefields. When the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen fell into American hands on March 7th, it opened the door to the German heartland. The victory stunned Hitler's high command and sealed the fate of countless German units stranded on the Western Front. Retreating Wehrmacht troops flooded into field hospitals, desperate, wounded, frostbitten, many without command structure or hope. The nurses were overwhelmed. One German report from the time described hospitals so full that men lay on the floor, on tables, even on window ledges, anywhere a bandage could reach. And then, amid this flood of suffering, came an unexpected sight. American soldiers, cautious, armed, and advancing through the ruins, began encountering these hospitals. To their astonishment, they found German nurses still tending both their own wounded and captured Allied soldiers. For the Americans, it was a moment of hesitation. The enemy they had fought so bitterly was suddenly no longer faceless. For the nurses, it was terror. Many had been told they would be executed or imprisoned by the Allies. Instead, something different unfolded. Something they could not have imagined even weeks earlier. In one camp near Beaupard, a group of U.S. Army medics arrived to find a German nurse performing surgery on a wounded American pilot using scavenged tools. The Americans, stunned, offered her real surgical instruments and helped complete the operation. Later, one medic wrote in his diary, "We had been told they were all cruel and cold, but she worked with tears in her eyes, just like us." It was this collision between propaganda and reality that would define the closing months of the war. The front lines were dissolving, but the human lines, between enemy and ally, between compassion and hatred, were being redrawn. These were not moments of grand strategy or political speeches. They were small, intimate acts of mercy inside a collapsing world. Moments that no historian could easily measure. But that left a mark deeper than most victories. And as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, these encounters began multiplying, until, in the final weeks of the war, one field hospital became the stage for a moment no one expected. American soldiers thanking German nurses for saving lives on both sides. By April 1945, the Western Front was no longer a front at all. It was a tide of surrender, retreat, and chaos. German formations disintegrated as American, British, and French divisions advanced across the Rhineland. The once unbreakable chain of command had splintered. Officers vanished, communication lines were cut, and medical staff found themselves stranded between advancing Allied armor and the wreckage of their own retreating troops. Inside field hospitals, scattered across the Ruhr pocket, German nurses faced impossible decisions. Some tried to evacuate with their units, carrying stretchers through bombed-out roads. Others stayed behind, unwilling to abandon the wounded. Men who could not walk, speak, or even lift their heads. Many of these nurses expected to die in place. At the same time, American medical units followed closely behind the frontline divisions. The U.S. Army's Medical Corps had perfected a system of mobile field hospitals that could set up in less than 12 hours, complete with sterilization units, blood plasma, and trained surgeons. When these American medics stumbled upon German hospitals still functioning in enemy territory, they were met with scenes of exhaustion and disbelief, but also professionalism. The rules of war, dictated by the Geneva Convention of 1929, required both sides to treat enemy wounded with humanity. But by 1945, few on the front lines still trusted in such laws. War had stripped away formalities. Villages burned, prisoners were executed, and hospitals were bombed. Yet, ironically, amid all this brutality, medicine became one of the last places where honor survived. When American officers entered captured German field hospitals, their first instinct was suspicion, searching for weapons, hidden soldiers, or Nazi propaganda. But instead of armed resistance, they found women in gray or white uniforms, hands stained with blood, still bandaging the dying. There was no ideology in their eyes, only fatigue, and the quiet determination to keep someone breathing a little longer. In Euskirchen, an American reconnaissance unit discovered a schoolhouse turned into a hospital. Inside were over 200 wounded German soldiers, a handful of civilians, and 7 nurses. The commanding officer ordered that no one be harmed or arrested until all wounded were stable. American medics offered supplies: sulfa powder, penicillin, clean bandages, items the Germans hadn't seen in months. One nurse reportedly wept when handed a small bottle of morphine. To her, it meant more than victory or defeat. It meant one more man might survive the night. Elsewhere, similar encounters unfolded. At Remagen, where the Allies had secured the critical bridgehead over the Rhine, U.S. medical officers found an abandoned Luftwaffe hospital. Only 2 German nurses remained, refusing to flee. They had amputated limbs, stitched wounds, and even buried the dead alone. Instead of arresting them, the Americans saluted their courage. One officer later wrote in his after-action report, "Their hands were steady even as shells fell nearby. We could not call them enemies." But these acts of compassion were not just personal. They carried strategic weight. The Allies wanted to show the German population that surrender did not mean annihilation. Every instance of humane treatment became part of a broader psychological war, a weapon of mercy instead of fear. Meanwhile, for the German nurses, these moments shattered years of indoctrination. They had been raised on the notion that the enemy was monstrous, barbaric, and cruel. Yet now, the enemy was sharing food rations and thanking them for saving lives. For many, it was the first time they realized how deeply they, too, had been victims, not just of war, but of lies. In the ruins of hospitals from Cologne to Kassel, the nurses began to witness something extraordinary. American soldiers offering gratitude, not because of ideology, but because of humanity. These small moments, a nod, a handshake, a quiet thank you, were like fragile threads stitching together the torn fabric of post-war Europe. The guns had not yet fallen silent, but something far greater had begun. The rediscovery of dignity, one patient at a time. And within weeks, one encounter between German nurses and American soldiers would come to symbolize this fragile mercy in the final days of the war. War strips away illusion faster than fire strips away paint. By the spring of 1945, the nurses of the collapsing Reich had seen every possible shade of human suffering. Yet what they witnessed in those final days, compassion from their sworn enemies, forced them to confront not only the war's horror, but the nature of their own humanity. This section explores three interwoven perspectives: the human, the tactical, and the emotional angles of that encounter. The human angle. Duty beyond flags. For most of the German nurses still at their posts in 1945, duty had long since transcended ideology. They were not fighting for Hitler or for victory. They were fighting for survival, for the men who lay in front of them, and for the faint echo of humanity that war had not yet erased. Their uniforms carried eagles and swastikas, but their actions spoke a different language, that of medicine, compassion, and endurance. Some of these women had been in service since Poland in 1939, others since the Eastern Front, where they had treated frostbite, gangrene, and mass trauma under unimaginable conditions. By the time the war reached Germany's own soil, most were ghosts of themselves, pale, malnourished, trembling from exhaustion and grief. When the Americans entered their hospitals, the first instinct of many was to continue working, not to flee, not to salute, but simply to keep the wounded alive. "We are nurses," one of them later said during interrogation at a displaced persons camp. "We do not stop until the blood stops flowing." For the American soldiers, many barely in their 20s, these women were the first Germans they met who did not carry rifles. They were young, frightened, and utterly drained. What they shared in that moment was not a truce, not even forgiveness. It was an unspoken recognition of human fragility. The tactical angle. Medicine as a battlefield war medicine was its own kind of combat. In the last months of the conflict, field hospitals were positioned dangerously close to the front lines. With the German retreat accelerating, the wounded often arrived faster than doctors could handle. In military terms, these hospitals were strategic liabilities, potential traps. The Allies feared ambushes disguised as medical sites. The Germans feared Allied bombing runs on their facilities. But the moment American medics stepped into captured hospitals and saw the truth, that there was no deception, only desperation, their perspective shifted. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, under the Geneva Convention, operated by a strict ethical code. The enemy wounded must receive treatment equal to their own. By honoring that rule, American soldiers turned medicine into a silent weapon of ideology. Proof that democracy and compassion could exist even amid total war. This was psychological warfare of a different kind. When German nurses saw Americans tending to their wounded, sharing medicine, or even thanking them for their care, it shattered years of Nazi propaganda. It was a victory not measured in territory or prisoners, but in the mind. Behind these quiet exchanges was a broader Allied strategy. American intelligence officers documented such scenes carefully. Reports from the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division show deliberate use of mercy as an instrument of occupation. The sight of Americans offering help, of soldiers with rifles lowering their weapons to carry the wounded, was itself a statement. The Reich's lies about the inhuman Allies had finally collapsed. The emotional angle, shock, shame, and awakening for the German nurses, the emotional impact of being thanked by American soldiers was profound, almost disorienting. They had grown up hearing that the Americans were barbaric invaders, destroyers of German civilization. Yet here they were, extending kindness in a moment when the world seemed devoid of it. Many of these women carried deep internal guilt. They had witnessed atrocities, or at least heard whispers, from the Eastern Front, from occupied territories, from soldiers who returned broken in body and soul. But until that spring, none had expected to face mercy from those who had every reason to hate them. In letters and post-war testimonies, a few surviving nurses wrote of that moment as one of unbearable confusion. One recalled, "They thanked us for saving lives. We had forgotten that word, thank you. We didn't know what to say." For the Americans, too, the shock ran deep. These were men who had fought through the Ardennes, who had seen comrades die at Hurtgen Forest and Bastogne. To see the enemy as human, as compassionate caregivers, broke the simplicity of wartime hatred. Some felt anger at the thought of pitying those responsible for so much death. Others felt only relief that, for once, the killing had stopped. That single word, thank you, carried a weight greater than medals. It signaled a quiet revolution in the hearts of those who spoke it and those who heard it. In that moment, the uniform ceased to matter. Only the act of mercy remained. And yet, this was only one layer of a much larger transformation unfolding across the collapsing Reich. A psychological turning point where compassion became more powerful than propaganda. The nurses would not forget it. Nor would the American medics who walked into those tents and saw their enemies kneeling beside the dying, whispering prayers under flickering lamps. The battlefield teaches soldiers to harden their hearts, to see the enemy not as human, but as a target. Yet, in the quiet chaos of those makeshift hospitals, something ancient and profoundly moral resurfaced. It was not ideology, not duty, but a shared instinct older than war itself, the obligation to preserve life. No matter whose it was, this section explores three final perspectives: the moral, technological, medical, and historical angles that reveal why the German nurse's story became one of the quietest yet most powerful reconciliations of the Second World War. The moral angle. Mercy amid ruins, morality. In 1945, Germany was a broken compass. The war had blurred every boundary, between right and wrong, between patriotism and fanaticism, between murder and obedience. Yet, inside the field hospitals, morality somehow endured. For the German nurses, mercy was both a rebellion and a surrender. To care for a dying American or British prisoner was to defy the ideology that had consumed their country. But it was also a surrender to their own conscience, to something greater than the Reich. Some nurses were reprimanded or threatened for treating captured Allied soldiers with too much compassion. Yet, by the war's end, that compassion had become the only thing keeping them sane. In one report from the U.S. Army's occupation archives, an officer described meeting a German nurse near Koblenz who had tended to both German and American wounded for days without sleep. When he asked her why she hadn't fled, she answered, "Because they were still breathing." Those 4 words summed up what the entire world had forgotten. That mercy, even in its smallest form, is an act of resistance against barbarity. For the Americans who witnessed it, The realization was equally powerful, the understanding that the enemy was capable of decency, even in defeat. These moments did not erase the atrocities of the war, but they reminded both sides that morality had not been entirely extinguished. It was still flickering, hidden beneath the ashes. The technological and medical angle, two worlds of healing. When American medical teams entered Germany, they brought with them the most advanced field technology of the war. Blood plasma transfusions, portable sterilizers, penicillin kits, and morphine injectors. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was staggering. While U.S. medics could replace bandages every few hours, German nurses were often forced to wash and reuse blood-soaked cloths. Where Americans used penicillin, Germans still relied on sulfa drugs or herbal substitutes, equipment that was standard for an American hospital. Stretchers, saline drips, field sterilizers had become near mythical luxuries in Germany's collapsing infrastructure. Yet, despite this gap, the German nurses' skill impressed their American counterparts. They had learned to adapt with nothing. They built makeshift operating tables from doors, disinfected tools over open flames, and used melted snow as saline substitute. Their efficiency came from desperation, but also from brilliance. One U.S. Army surgeon later remarked, "They had no medicine left, no electricity, no supplies, and still they kept people alive." It was not technology, but discipline and willpower that had sustained them. In a strange way, these exchanges of knowledge, the Germans learning from the Americans' advanced tools and the Americans admiring the Germans' resilience, became the first steps toward the post-war medical cooperation that would later define Europe's reconstruction. Many of those same nurses went on to work in Allied-run hospitals during the occupation, their skills becoming a bridge between enemies. In the end, science and compassion achieved what armies could not: reconciliation through healing. The historical angle. The unwritten chapter of surrender history often remembers surrender in terms of dates and signatures. May 7, 1945, the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. But long before that ink dried in Reims, a quieter form of surrender had already taken place, in the hands of those who chose to heal instead of hate. The story of the German nurses and the American soldiers who thanked them is rarely found in textbooks. It lacks the grandeur of tank battles or the scale of aerial warfare. But to those who lived it, it marked the true end of the war. Not when the guns fell silent, but when empathy returned. After Germany's defeat, Allied command investigated thousands of military personnel for war crimes. Yet, notably, very few nurses or medical staff were ever charged. On the contrary, many were praised for their conduct. Some were even recommended for humanitarian citations by U.S. officers. Letters exchanged between American and German medics in the months following the war paint a moving picture. Requests for medical supplies for displaced civilians, offers of cooperation between former enemies. Personal gratitude. Simple notes that said, "You reminded me what a human being looks like." These small, almost invisible threads of kindness wove themselves into the moral fabric of post-war Europe. When the Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949, expanding protections for medical personnel, many of these unrecorded experiences indirectly influenced their design. The nurse's story was not one of victory or defeat. It was one of survival, of ethics enduring in a world that had forgotten them. By the time the last field hospitals were disbanded in the summer of 1945, many of these women had disappeared back into civilian life, silent about what they had seen. Yet the memory of those moments, of the shock on their faces, when the Americans said thank you, lived on in those who were there. It was the smallest act of peace in the greatest war the world had ever known. And now, as that fragile peace began to take form, the story reached its emotional turning point, one that would change both sides forever. April 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany. The thunder of artillery had ceased, but the silence that followed was worse. Smoke drifted between the broken walls of a ruined town. Remagen, once proud and peaceful, now reduced to dust and whispering echoes. German soldiers, most barely more than boys, stumbled through the rubble with bandaged arms and hollow eyes. Above them, the white flag fluttered weakly in the cold spring wind. Inside a half-destroyed convent turned field hospital. A young German nurse named Anneliese Weber tightened a tourniquet on a wounded Wehrmacht corporal. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. Around her, cots filled every inch of floor space. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, blood, and burning oil. Hours earlier, the last German resistance in the region had collapsed. Now, the sound of foreign boots echoed in the courtyard. American troops. Anneliese froze. For weeks, propaganda had warned of what awaited them. Vengeful occupiers, merciless and cruel. She braced herself as the door burst open. Sunlight cut through the dim interior, revealing a group of U.S. infantrymen in muddy uniforms. Their weapons were drawn, but not aimed. They scanned the room, the cots, the moaning patients, the nurses too tired to stand. One of the Americans, a medic sergeant, stepped forward. He looked around slowly, then said almost softly, "Who's in charge here?" Anneliese didn't answer. None of them did. The officer repeated the question, this time lowering his rifle. Then, seeing the chaos of the ward, the feverish men, the blood-soaked bandages, he simply dropped his pack, knelt beside a patient, and began working. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the room stirred to life again. The Americans joined the Germans, shoulder to shoulder, dressing wounds, lifting stretchers, handing out what little morphine remained. The boundaries between friend and foe began to blur. Language replaced by gestures, by quiet cooperation. Outside, the sound of tanks rumbling through the streets reminded everyone that the war was not yet officially over. But inside that convent, a strange calm settled in. Hours passed. The American medic approached Anneliese. His face was lined with fatigue, but his tone was gentle. "You did good work," he said, nodding toward the ward. "Most of these men would have been gone if you hadn't kept them alive." She didn't know how to respond. The words felt foreign, praise from an enemy. The medic continued, handing her a small tin of American medical supplies. Clean gauze, penicillin vials, iodine. "Use these," he said. "You'll need them tonight." For a moment, she simply stared at the box in disbelief. She had expected to be arrested, interrogated, not aided. When she finally looked up, the medic had already turned to leave. Before he did, he stopped, looked back, and said quietly, "Thank you for taking care of our boys, too." It took a moment for the meaning to sink in. Later that evening, as dusk fell over the shattered town, the nurses gathered outside the hospital. The Americans had set up camp nearby, tending to their own wounded. The air was filled with the low hum of distant engines and the faint murmurs of men who, for the first time in years, were no longer trying to kill each other. Anneliese stood near the courtyard gate, still holding the tin of supplies. She turned it over in her hands, the faint embossed letters, U.S. Medical Corps, catching the fading light. Around her, the other nurses whispered in disbelief. Some wept quietly. None of them had imagined this. Gratitude from the very soldiers, they had been told, were monsters. Inside the building, a few of the German wounded stirred awake. One of them, an older officer, muttered weakly, "They thanked you? Americans?" Anneliese nodded. He exhaled, staring at the ceiling. "Then perhaps the war truly is ending." Over the next few days, that moment of fragile humanity spread through the region. More field hospitals were discovered by advancing Allied troops. And again, the same pattern emerged. American soldiers entered, expecting hostility. Instead, they found nurses still working under impossible conditions, tending to both German and captured Allied wounded with equal care. The Americans, stunned by the professionalism and composure of these women, began to help rather than hinder. They shared supplies, offered food, and, in some cases, even evacuated the nurses along with the injured to safer areas. It was not a treaty or an order. It was instinct, the moral reflex of human beings who had finally grown tired of hate. One U.S. sergeant later wrote in his journal, "They looked like ghosts in white, working among ruins. We went in thinking we'd find the enemy. What we found were angels in uniforms." In the following days, a handful of American soldiers returned to the convent hospital with food and blankets. They brought coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Luxuries the German staff had not seen in months. One of the younger nurses burst into tears at the sight of it. No one spoke much. Words seemed inadequate, but the small gestures, a shared meal, a nod of mutual respect, carried more weight than speeches or treaties ever could. Annalisa, writing in her diary that night, tried to describe the feeling. "They thanked us today. For what, I do not know. For being human, perhaps." That sentence would later be found by an American translator months after the war ended. It was brief, but it captured the essence of that moment. A bridge across a sea of blood and ruin. The war had not officially ended, but its spirit of destruction had already begun to die. May 2, 1945. Outskirts of Munich, Germany, the war was breathing its last. The Reich was collapsing from every direction. Berlin surrounded, Hitler gone, the radio silent. Across the countryside, soldiers surrendered in groups, throwing their weapons into ditches. But amid the chaos, small pockets of humanity still flickered. In burned-out hospitals, roadside aid stations, and convents where German nurses kept working long after the fighting had ceased. In one such place, a converted railway depot serving as a temporary hospital, the same young nurse, Annalisa Weber, worked beside a team of American medics. The walls were cracked from nearby bomb blasts. The roof leaked when it rained. Yet, inside, the wounded lay side by side. German and American, enemy and ally, indistinguishable beneath the same white sheets. It was a strange peace, fragile, improvised, but real. Annalisa noticed something one afternoon that would stay with her for the rest of her life. A U.S. lieutenant, no older than 23, sat beside a German prisoner whose leg had been amputated. The man, once a Luftwaffe pilot, lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. Without a word, the American soldier reached into his coat, pulled out a small piece of chocolate, and placed it in the German's hand. The pilot looked at him with disbelief. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. For a brief second, two enemies shared something deeper than war. Understanding. Outside the depot, rows of abandoned vehicles lined the roads. Civilians wandered aimlessly, clutching suitcases and photographs. The war had ended for them, but peace had not yet begun. That evening, as dusk fell, an American officer entered the hospital with a message. "The fighting's over," he said quietly. "Germany has surrendered." The nurses stopped moving. The words hung in the air, heavy, unreal. For months, they had lived in perpetual motion, measuring life in minutes and morphine doses. Now, everything stood still. One of the older nurses began to sob, not from sadness, but exhaustion. Another simply sank to the floor, staring blankly ahead. The Americans watched in silence, understanding that this was not celebration. It was release. Annalisa stepped outside into the cool May evening. The sky above was streaked with the last traces of sunset, glowing over the ruins. Across the field, she saw a group of American soldiers lowering their flag to half-mast, not for victory, but for the dead. The symbolism struck her deeply. Even in triumph, they mourned. 2 days later, a convoy of Allied medical trucks arrived to evacuate the wounded. The German nurses were told they could remain or travel with the convoy to assist. Many chose to stay behind, their families still somewhere in the ruins of Germany. But a few, including Anneliese, decided to go. Before leaving, she walked through the hospital one last time. Rows of patients, once enemies, now slept side by side. She stopped at each bed, checking dressings, whispering quiet words of comfort. When she reached the doorway, she turned back to the American medic who had first entered her hospital weeks earlier. He smiled faintly and saluted her. "Thank you, nurse," he said. "You helped end this better than any of us could." It was not an official farewell, but it was enough. The convoy rolled out at dawn. The roads were littered with the debris of a fallen empire. Broken helmets, burned trucks, craters filled with rainwater. Civilians lined the roadside, silent, hollow-eyed, unsure who now ruled their lives. As the trucks passed, some saluted, others turned away, but among them were mothers and children who waved, not in triumph, but in gratitude. For the first time, they saw soldiers not as conquerors, but as men bringing order back to a shattered world. In the back of one truck, Anneliese sat beside an American nurse, both wrapped in military blankets. The American offered her a cigarette. Anneliese hesitated, then accepted. They smoked in silence as the countryside rolled by, burned villages giving way to green fields returning to life. The war, for all its horror, had not destroyed everything. Later, in her post-war testimony, Anneliese would write about that convoy. "They did not treat us as enemies. They treated us as nurses, as people who had seen too much, but who still believed in life." When the American soldier thanked me, I realized something the war had tried to erase. That mercy is not weakness. It is strength. That line would be quoted decades later in documentaries and remembrance ceremonies. A quiet reminder that compassion had survived even in the darkest hour. In the days that followed, American officers documented the testimonies of medical personnel across Germany. They were shocked to find hundreds of nurses still working in dangerous conditions, many without pay or supplies. Reports from U.S. Army medical divisions praised their courage, noting how they treated Allied prisoners even under threat of punishment. One American colonel wrote in his report, "The German women in white, they did not surrender. They simply kept healing until the guns went silent." These words were never meant for the public, but they captured something timeless, that even amid total war, the smallest acts of decency can outlive empires. When the convoy reached the Allied base near Frankfurt, Anneliese disembarked, handing over her patients. The American soldiers lined up to thank her, some offering rations, others a simple handshake. She stood silently, unsure what to say. Then, almost instinctively, she placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "Danke." The soldiers understood. No flags, no anthems, no speeches, just gratitude shared between those who had endured the unimaginable. The war in Europe was over, but for those who had lived through it, the memories and the mercy would remain forever. That night, the floodlights around the camp dimmed, and for the first time in 6 years, the skies above Germany were silent. No bombers, no sirens, only the quiet hum of a continent beginning to heal. In that silence, the words of the American medic lingered in her mind. The same words that had shattered her expectations in a ruined convent weeks before. "Thank you for saving them." That gratitude, born in ruins, would become the fragile foundation of peace. The world was changing, Germany defeated, the Allies victorious, but humanity rediscovered. From those ashes would rise not vengeance, but reconciliation. In the weeks that followed Germany's surrender, the guns fell silent. but the echoes of war continued to shape every moment. Across Europe, millions of displaced people wandered the roads, searching for homes that no longer existed. Entire cities were husks of stone and steel. And within the heart of this devastation, something remarkable began to emerge. Not from politics or speeches, but from human decency. American soldiers, once trained to destroy the enemy, were now tasked with rebuilding the very nation they had fought to defeat. Their first orders were simple: restore order, provide food, and tend to the wounded, regardless of uniform. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, the same organization that had stormed through France and Belgium, now established field hospitals across Germany to care for civilians and former enemies alike. It was within these makeshift hospitals that the memory of those quiet moments, when German nurses and American soldiers had stood side by side, began to spread. Word traveled fast among units and civilians alike. Stories were told of American soldiers who saluted enemy nurses, of German women who treated American wounded without hesitation, and of the small but profound gratitude exchanged in burned-out churches and factory infirmaries. These stories became the foundation for what would later be called the compassion line, a symbolic thread of mercy that crossed the boundaries of hatred and war. For the German nurses, however, peace came with uncertainty. Many were now prisoners of war themselves, temporarily detained in Allied-controlled zones. Their uniforms, once symbols of duty, were replaced by armbands marking them as medical personnel under review. Yet, to the surprise of many, the Americans treated them not as captives, but as colleagues. In the ruined hospitals of Frankfurt, Kassel, and Regensburg, captured German nurses were asked to continue their work under U.S. supervision. They treated German civilians, Allied wounded, and sometimes even former SS members, the very men whose ideology had led to the destruction around them. It was a strange moral test. Could one still serve humanity after serving a nation that had betrayed it? For most, the answer was yes, because for them, healing had never been about politics. It had been about survival. Anneliese Weber, like many others, was eventually assigned to an American-run relief hospital near Darmstadt. There she found herself working beside nurses from Britain, France, and even Poland, countries once considered mortal enemies. Together, they faced outbreaks of disease, malnutrition, and the emotional wreckage of 6 years of war. The Americans noticed something extraordinary in these German women. They were quiet, disciplined, and unwavering in their focus. Despite losing everything, their homes, their country, their sense of purpose, they worked tirelessly. An American Red Cross officer wrote in his journal, "They do not ask for rest. They ask for more bandages." Meanwhile, Allied authorities began documenting the testimonies of German medical staff. These records, later preserved in the archives of the U.S. Army Surgeon General's office, painted a vivid picture of humanity persisting in chaos. Reports described nurses performing surgeries without anesthesia, carrying wounded soldiers through burning streets, and continuing their duties even as enemy tanks rolled past their windows. One American colonel summarized it best. Their hospitals were ruins, their supplies gone, yet they worked until the end, not for victory, for life itself. This acknowledgement, though rarely publicized, became a quiet act of respect. For the Americans, it was a chance to show that compassion was stronger than propaganda. For the Germans, it was a revelation that mercy could come even from the hands of the conqueror. By late summer 1945, as Germany began to rebuild under Allied occupation, the bond between these former enemies deepened. Many American doctors and nurses wrote letters of recommendation for their German counterparts, helping them secure positions in post-war medical institutions. In one letter preserved in the Bavarian State Archives, an American field surgeon wrote of a German nurse he had worked with in the final days of the war. "She saved lives without asking whose side they were on." That alone earns her a place in any nation's hospital. These gestures, though small, began to heal wounds far deeper than the physical. The war was over, but the memory of gratitude, that simple word, thank you, lingered in the minds of all who had witnessed it. The story of German nurses being thanked by American soldiers was not an isolated tale. It was part of a larger truth, that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion had not surrendered. And as the rubble of Europe began to clear, this compassion would quietly reshape the future. Not through declarations or politics, but through the people who had lived it. By the end of 1945, the smoke of war had lifted, but the emotional haze lingered. Germany was a land divided, not just by occupation zones, but by guilt, grief, and disbelief. The Third Reich had fallen, yet its shadows clung to the ruins. Hospitals became sanctuaries for recovery, not only of the body, but of conscience. In these places, the remnants of war slowly gave way to a fragile kind of peace. American doctors trained German nurses in modern techniques, penicillin treatments, surgical sterilization, and field trauma response. In return, the German women shared the quiet discipline that had kept them alive during years of bombardment and scarcity. It was an exchange of humanity, unrecorded in official treaties, but etched forever in memory. Many American soldiers later spoke of how their perception of the enemy changed in those days. The propaganda that had painted Germans as faceless aggressors began to dissolve as they met the nurses and civilians who had also suffered. They realized that victory was not about humiliation, but about restoration. In one interview years later, a U.S. Army medic, Sergeant William Tate, recalled, "They weren't our enemies anymore. They were just people, exhausted, broken, and trying to save lives like us. When I thanked that nurse, I think I was thanking her for reminding me what decency looked like." For the German nurses, those simple words, "thank you," carried a power far greater than any medal. They symbolized something unimaginable just months before: forgiveness. In the post-war years, many of these women faded into obscurity. They went on to rebuild families, hospitals, and communities. But in personal letters and memoirs, their memories remained vivid. Annalisa Weber, who later emigrated to Canada, wrote in her diary, "The war tried to destroy the meaning of kindness. But in that moment, when the American soldier thanked me, I realized that kindness can survive anything, even hatred." Her words captured a truth that historians would later call the quiet reconciliation. While diplomats argued over borders and reparations, ordinary men and women, nurses, doctors, soldiers, were already laying the foundation for peace, one human act at a time. In the years that followed, the story of German nurses who tended American soldiers began to resurface in Allied newspapers and Red Cross bulletins. These accounts were modest, but deeply symbolic. Stories of compassion that offered a counterpoint to the brutality of the war. In 1948, a small ceremony was held at a U.S. Army base in Stuttgart, where surviving German nurses were invited as honored guests. An American general, addressing them in German, said, "You served in war not as enemies, but as healers. The world will remember that even in defeat, you chose mercy." The audience, composed of both Germans and Americans, stood in silence. Some wept. It was one of the earliest moments of public reconciliation between the two nations. As the 1950s dawned and Germany began to rebuild under Allied supervision, the lessons of those wartime nurses quietly shaped the future of European medicine. Joint training programs between American and German hospitals became common. The Red Cross expanded rapidly, embracing an international identity that transcended nationalism. But beyond policy or reform, it was the human legacy that endured, the shared understanding that compassion is stronger than ideology. For the soldiers who had once fought on opposite sides, Memories of those nurses remained among their most vivid wartime recollections. In letters home, they spoke not of battle victories, but of the day an enemy nurse held their hand or whispered a quiet prayer. For the nurses, those encounters restored a part of their humanity that the war had tried to erase. They had seen the abyss and chosen to heal rather than hate. Decades later, when veterans and survivors met again under the banners of friendship and remembrance, those moments of gratitude still echoed. The war had turned nations into enemies, but mercy had turned enemies into people again. And for every German nurse who heard that simple word, "Thank you," it was as if history itself paused, if only for a heartbeat, to remember what it meant to be human. The ruins would be rebuilt, the wounds would fade, but that fragile exchange of kindness between conqueror and conquered, that brief, human bridge built amid ashes, would remain eternal. In the vast ocean of World War II history, with its battles, dictators, and destruction, the story of a single nurse or soldier can seem insignificant. Yet, it is often in these quiet, human moments that history's truest meaning is found. The encounter between German nurses and American soldiers in 1945 was not written into treaties or recorded in official communiques. It did not shape borders or command armies, but it revealed something deeper, a spark of humanity that endured even after 6 years of total war had stripped the world bare. For the German nurses, that gratitude from an American soldier shattered the last remnants of enemy propaganda. For the Americans, it reminded them that mercy, not power, defines true victory. Between them, across the ruins of Europe, compassion became a bridge stronger than any steel or alliance. These women, often forgotten by history, stood as symbols of endurance and dignity. They had no weapons, no ranks, and no voice in the decisions that brought nations to ruin. Yet they healed the broken, friend and foe alike. In their silence, they carried the moral weight of a continent. One could say they helped end the war in a way guns never could. The war's aftermath would see Germany rebuilt, Europe divided, and the world enter a new era of tension. But beneath the headlines and politics, there remained this quieter legacy, that even in the darkest chapters of humanity, compassion has a way of surviving. When the American soldiers thanked those German nurses, they were not just expressing gratitude. They were acknowledging a truth that history often forgets, that the real courage lies not only in fighting, but in forgiving. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all, that amid the rubble, amid the horror and loss, people still chose to see each other as human beings. In the fading light of that spring in 1945, as the guns went silent and Europe took its first breath of peace, those words lingered, soft, humble, yet eternal. Thank you. Not for surrender, not for victory, but for remembering that even in war, mercy matters.